here we are on the eve of Ryzen 3000, AMD about to most likely take all CPU performance crowns. That includes top performance, efficiency, price performance. They're probably just about to dominate everything. But things could not have been more different. And, man, it was really bad. Bulldozer was horrible. Um, and it's disappointing because it came off of the at least moderately good Phenom 2. As a quick history lesson, there was the Pentium series where Intel tried to get to, well, they said they were going to try to scale to 10 gigahertz in the early 2000s. That did not happen. They just created the most power hungry, stupid series they've ever conceived of. Um, and then AMD hit them hard with the FX series that just absolutely destroyed them. It was to the point where Intel had to take $1,000 Xeons and overclock them, and just to hopefully be in the same ballpark as AMD's much more efficient Athlon chips. But then Intel, of course, they have resources. They came back with the Core 2 lineup, and it wiped the floor with Athlon. It wiped the floor. And it was very comparable to what happened with Ryzen 1000. You had all of the previous Pentiums were just obsolete. Like you had low-end Core 2s better than the most expensive Pentiums. That's how bad it was. Which again, Ryzen launch made even the 5 gigahertz 8 core pile driver chip just a joke compared to even their $100 CPU overall. So AMD then released Phenom 1, which was basically an iterative core increase of the Athlon series. It didn't really increase IPC much though, and clock speeds really didn't go up. You know, Anand of AnandTech called it his most disappointing series launch he's ever seen in the CPU space. He was really hoping for, it was a new name, so Phenom, he was hoping to be like what Athlon did, and that's just not what happened. But then Phenom 2 came, and that brought a 5 to 30% IPC increase over Phenom 1, just like about a year later or so, and it was overall very competitive with Core 2, and even with the first Core I series, at least at first. But Bulldozer was delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. And so over time, they just kept releasing over like 2 years faster and faster clocked Phenoms and Athlon 2s that just couldn't keep up. Although they were pretty good. I mean, we're talking about a 6-core Phenom 2 times 6 that cost $300 against a $600 to $1,000 6-core i7. And even though it was weaker and highly threaded tasks, it was actually about 80% as powerful for about the same power usage. So it wasn't terrible, right? It wasn't like AMD was like leagues behind. You could kind of compare it to like the Fury series compared to Maxwell, right? They were definitely behind overall. But there were some chips like the Fury Nano just as efficient as Maxwell, and no matter how they got there, you could say they had to use HBM, but whatever. The fact is they made something comparatively good. But then Bulldozer came out, like I said, and it was just awful. So what would have happened, though, if AMD, instead of going with Bulldozer, die shrunk Phenom and made a Phenom 3? How would they go about doing this, most likely? Well, they would use that die space to increase the core count, of course. That would increase the die size. It would be more expensive than Bulldozer, but it would have probably used less energy, and they probably could have increased IPC by another 15% by doubling L3 cache and increasing L2 cache a little bit. And at first glance, that doesn't sound like that much fun, but hindsight's 2020, and we know Bulldozer was actually a step back in many regards from Phenom 2. I remember telling people, nah, get a Phenom 2 times 4 over any of these Bulldozer chips. It costs half as much and frankly uses about the same energy and is a little better at gaming per core. So that was pretty terrible. So before I get to the charts, I did some math, and at first I was like, I was angry because I was like, the math I'm doing is showing that even a simple die shrunk Phenom 3 would have been light years ahead of the Bulldozer chip. But then I looked at the TDP and I was like, you know what? I don't think I'm taking into account the Global Foundry's 45 nanometer to 32 nanometer performance metrics correctly. And I tried to account for core increase and balance that out with TDP increases, because it's a balancing act. You increase clock speeds a little bit, you don't get the same amount of power savings, right? Because a 50% reduction in power or 50% increase in performance that they advertise, it's either or. So you have to find a middle ground. You don't get 50% more performance and half the power usage. You have to decide, well, what do you want? Do you want like 40% more performance, but like 40% more performance overall, but your power usage is actually a little higher or around the same? It's a balancing act. And so while I was doing this math, I figured out why AMD did go with Bulldozer, though. And that's, at first, it seemed like I wasn't going to get nearly the performance boost I was hoping for per core by simply die shrinking. When I did when I plugged in my first numbers, I had like 200 watt TDPs, and I was like, whoa. And I bet that's what happened with AMD, is they did the math and they said, hey, Phenom's done scaling. We're not getting any higher, so what do we need to do? Well, let's strip out everything from the core that we can. And that will allow us to make a smaller die size per core. And also, you know what? It will allow us to increase clock speeds. That was the mentality. But it turned out to be, in hindsight, close to the net burst mentality Intel had. And if you go and look at the Bulldozer clocks, it didn't get them that much higher clock speeds. So keep that in mind. I have taken into account balancing TDP with clock speed increases, and the end result is Phenom III really only would have been clocked like 5 to 10% faster. It would have had around 10 to 15% more IPC, but it would have kept power usage in check. And it would have performed better than Bulldozer. All right, so let's take a look here. Okay, so let's take a look at this chart here. Okay, the first thing you want to look at is where we're coming from. Now, this actually took me a lot of time, because there is an enormous amount of Phenoms that existed. I forgot how many goddamn Phenoms they made, because it was like 2 years of just faster clock speed increases of every type of Phenom they could fathom coming up with. So these are enough, though, to get an idea, right? I think so. These are the die size of these chips, so they actually got pretty big, and these are the costs. And again, these costs were all over the place over the years. This is just what I'm going to use as a general idea of how much these cost in their heyday. And then you got your TDPs, cache. So when I came up with the Phenom III series, right, I figured they could go a little bigger in die size, but generally I'm doubling the cache, because that's what they did with Phenom II to Phenom 1, and they did net them a lot more IPC. And I also increased the L2 cache. And this is kind of really a catch-all for other core architecture enhancements they made. And I had to do something that increased the die size, relatively speaking. So that's taken into account when I do TDP calculations, IPC calculations, die size calculations. This is roughly how it would shake out, though. And what we have is Phenom 3 times 6s, natively meant for times 6, with a smaller die size than the times 4s, and they are clocked a bit faster, but not a ton faster, right? Like if you look, yeah, Bulldozer would have been clocked faster. Yeah, it would have been. But look at these TDP differences here. We're looking, and this down here is 95 watt. They can't even get a Bulldozer chip below 95 watts, at least at launch. And these... I think this would have, like, let's go here. So compare this times 6, which they would have charged more for. And these costs take into account die size and the markups that it would have been a little more expensive to manufacture this architecture, I think. I mean, this would have been, like, way better than the FX170. Yes, I know. I understand that this is clocked like 30% less, but it also uses 20% less energy, and at least it has 15% higher IPC. At least it doesn't sacrifice single-threaded performance. And And the problem with Bulldozer is how inconsistent its performance was. I remember, I believe it was Tom's Hardware's review said AMD is pricing the FX 8150 in between the i5 and the i7, and at times it comes closer, beats the i7, but much of the time it loses to the i5. And if you're going to price it in between these chips, it should always be at least above the thing it costs more than, and it just wasn't. It was a complete failure in that regard. It used like double the energy too, and it would sometimes lose while using double the energy. So at least right when you have this times 6 here, remember they don't have a hyper-threading with Phenom, so that's why they need to keep the core counts higher than Intel. At least here it would use 105 watts, and this would be priced to really compete with the 2500K. It used 10% more energy, and in single-threaded apps it'd probably be about 10% weaker, but it would be clocked a little faster, you know, so it would be about the same. And it would use more energy to win in multi-threading. And that would have been way, way better than what happened with Bulldozer. It's at first I thought this was going to be a slam dunk. I'm angry at AMD for not releasing this. But, you know, I'll get to the charts in a second. It wouldn't have been a slam dunk. Intel would have still been ahead. But AMD could have kept up at least, you know. And that would have been, I mean, like for instance, when I got that Ivy Bridge i5 in 2012, you know, I don't know if for the same price I could have gotten a times 6 Phenom III. I would have probably gone with the Phenom. And remember, these come with 32 PCI 2.0 lanes, not 16. So it had an I/O advantage too. This would have been excellent for content creators. In many ways, it would have been a more expensive, little bit weaker Ryzen before Ryzen existed. It wouldn't have been as efficient as Ryzen, but it probably would have brought higher core counts down quicker. And to be honest, I bet Intel would have launched mainstream 6-core and 8-core chips with Broadwell instead of with Coffee Lake. And it's kind of depressing to think of that didn't happen. So let's now take a look to at how I think the performance would have shaken out. And this is taking into account core counts, if they matter for the application, and increased clock speeds versus the previous Phenoms. And additionally, well, like for gaming, IPC won't be as much of an increase, but it would be for like professional applications. So I've only got a couple of charts here, but let's do one gaming one. And the problem is I had to kind of find games that scaled okay with cores. I didn't want to go with like the only game, which I don't know what it would have been back then, that scaled perfectly with cores, because that was not the norm. I think Crysis 2, though, was a pretty good average of gaming CPU performance at the time. It could take into account higher core counts, but it also realistically liked strong cores. And so let's see what would have happened here. The Phenom 3 times 6, this was the one I said would probably be about $260. Yeah, I think it would have beaten the 2600K in gaming. It didn't have hyper-threading. It had 6 cores. Crysis 2 uses 6 cores, and it would have really scaled well in this game. It would have used more energy, though, right? It's like 10%, 10% better at gaming, but it uses more than 10% more energy. And I don't know how well it would have overclocked. But again, for around the same price, you're getting more cores, a little bit better gaming performance, not quite as good efficiency, but you know, who cares? And then even if these workstation chips here, like you get this 10-core, 140-watt chip, I mean, it's power hungry, but you're still gaming with the best of the best. And that's what people should have expected when they buy a high-end chip. And moving down the list, I mean, you can see, you know, you have a 100-watt Phenom III beating a 125-watt FX 4170, and this one was often marketed as like the only good gaming FX chip at launch, or the only acceptable gaming chip, because it at least beat a 980 Black Edition. And then as we go down the list, you have the Athlon times 4, and I mean, you know, no, this wouldn't be fantastic, but it would keep up with i3s at least. You know, this would be up there with the lower clocked Phenom 2s, and this would be using less energy than the previous generation, and it'd be dirt cheap. This has a smaller die size than the previous Athlon times 4s, and they could sell this for like $90. It would have been great. It would have competed with Intel's Pentiums actually at the time. And then of course let's move on to a non-gaming task, and this is where it really would have excelled. Now, keep in mind, they would sell this for like like twice as much as the top Bulldozer chip, but it's also 50% stronger while using slightly more energy. The efficiency is way better. This is really competing with Intel's SandyBridge E, and it would have competed pretty well, just like Ryzen. Again, except unlike Ryzen, where the efficiency was better than Intel, the efficiency wouldn't be as good as Intel, but at least they could bring in more cores for the money and keep up with gaming performance. And I mean, yeah, I don't know what much else there is to say. This would have probably been sold for about the same price as this one. It's a cut down die. And yeah, I mean, it just a much, much more competitive series overall. That's all there really is to say. In conclusion, I wish AMD would have just die shrunk Phenom, added more cores, and increased the IPC with other moderate, realistic architectural improvements. You would have gotten something that, no, it wouldn't have had like 20% higher clocks, 30% higher clocks like Bulldozer and Piledriver brought to the table. You would have gotten 5 to 10% faster clocks than Phenom II, slight reductions in power usage, decent increases in core count, and pricing would have been about the same, if not slightly more than the previous gen. Again, this isn't a raffle stomping or a barn burner like Ryzen has turned out to be. But it would have kept up with Intel, and it would have been probably similar to how Phenom II was regarded of, well, competition's back. Thanks for coming back to the party, AMD. You're not in the lead, but some of your products are better again, and you are definitely competitive. And you know, in hindsight, I wonder at what point AMD knew Bulldozer was a failure, because unfortunately they probably didn't know until about a year before launch, and by then they probably made the hard decision that it was too late to just simply die shrink Phenom. That's probably what happened. But I do wonder, you know, if they could have figured it out maybe 2 years before, maybe they would have had enough time to just do the redesign. I mean, all they're doing is doubling the L3 cache, increasing L2 cache by a bit, and die shrinking. I can't imagine that would have been incredibly hard to do if they would have caught it early enough that they just need. I mean, if anything, they could have said, you know, let's just do this and hold the Bulldozer architecture for server chips or something, which wouldn't have been a bad idea. It's just quite depressing. And here's the funny thing is, at first I said, you know what though, maybe this is why Threadripper and Ryzen and Zen are so good. Maybe through pressure diamonds are made. Maybe we wouldn't have gotten Infinity Fabric without this. Maybe we wouldn't have. Maybe we wouldn't have this amazing architecture. Yeah, there were like 4 or 5 years of no CPU enhancements, but now maybe we're making up for that quickly, aren't we? Maybe. Coulda, shoulda, woulda. We don't know what the future would look like. Because I could just as easily make the argument this kept up with SandyBridge. Maybe Intel would have brought us 6 and 8 core CPUs in 2014 with Broadwell instead of 2017 and 18 with Coffee Lake. Maybe AMD would have kept up and made as much money. Maybe Radeon wouldn't have been as starved for money. Maybe we would have Navi already because they wouldn't be hard on money. I don't know. I think it's probably more likely we might actually be 2 years ahead in CPU performance, just as likely as we never would have gotten Ryzen. But the fact is, we just don't know. Well, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I thought it was fascinating. This is something I've always wondered, you know, what would a die shrunk Phenom have looked like if we could have skipped Bulldozer? But either way, at least we're about to, within a month, hear how awesome Ryzen 3000 is going to be, right? If you like this video, please like it. Please share it. This is something I've seen in a lot of forums where people go, why didn't they just die shrink Phenom? Share this with those people. This took a lot of work. And please, if you like videos like this, sign up for my Patreon, where you can make suggestions and help support me so I keep making videos like this. Very curious to see the discussions in the comment section below. Thank you.